Some stories begin in the most ordinary places, on what seems like just another regular day, but in those moments human nature is often revealed in ways that leave a lasting impact, etching themselves into the fabric of our memories. That's exactly what happened one late afternoon at Union First Bank, a well-established financial institution located in the heart of Los Angeles. The bank stood as a pillar of the community, its polished facade reflecting the bustling city around it, a symbol of financial security and prosperity. Little did anyone know, the seemingly mundane setting was about to become the stage for a powerful display of human interaction. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, a palpable hum of stress vibrating through the air. The bank was unusually busy, with long lines snaking from the teller stations to the entrance, resembling a slow-moving river of anxious customers. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the body heat, adding to the overall discomfort. Customers sighed, checked their watches with increasing frequency, shifted impatiently from foot to foot, and murmured their frustrations under their breath. Each person was lost in their own world of financial worries and time constraints. The air crackled with unspoken anxieties, deadlines looming large in their minds. Employees rushed to assist the never-ending flow of people, their smiles strained and mechanical, their patience wearing thin under the relentless pressure of demanding customers and mounting paperwork. The weight of the day was etched on their faces, a silent testament to the daily grind. Behind the counter, Brittany Wallace, a young bank teller in her late 20s, had already had enough of the day. The endless monotony of counting money, processing transactions, and dealing with customer complaints had chipped away at her enthusiasm, leaving her feeling drained and cynical. Her eyes, heavy with exhaustion and a hint of boredom, flickered toward the line, automatically assessing which customers she needed to serve quickly to meet her performance goals, and which ones weren't worth her time, those she deemed likely to cause problems or take up too much of her valuable time. She had developed a keen sense for spotting trouble, those who asked too many questions, those who seemed confused, those who were simply taking too long. That's when her gaze landed on an elderly black woman standing quietly in the queue, clutching an envelope with slightly trembling hands, an easy target in her weary mind. The woman's name was Linda Carter, a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher who had dedicated her life to shaping young minds, instilling in them the values of kindness, respect, and perseverance. She was a woman of quiet dignity and unwavering principles, never one to ask for favors or cause a fuss. She had always believed in hard work, honesty, and playing by the rules, but today she had no choice but to speak up, to advocate for herself in the face of what she perceived as an injustice. She had noticed unexpected fees deducted from her account, small amounts perhaps, but significant enough to impact her fixed pension, her carefully planned budget for her golden years. Every dollar mattered, representing hours of careful saving and prudent financial planning. These weren't just numbers on a statement, they represented her security, her independence, and her peace of mind. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped forward when it was finally her turn, approaching the counter with a mix of apprehension and determination. She adjusted her glasses, her gaze meeting Brittany's with a polite but firm expectation of respect. Her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the subtle authority that came from years of commanding a classroom, guiding and nurturing generations of students. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she began, her voice clear and steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I believe there's been a mistake on my account. I've been charged fees I wasn't informed about, and I'd like to understand why." Brittany barely spared her a glance, her fingers still tapping at her keyboard as she responded dismissively, her attention focused more on the screen than on the woman standing before her. The rhythmic clicking of the keys was the only acknowledgement of Linda's presence, a subtle indication of her lack of interest. "Those are standard account maintenance fees, ma'am," she stated flatly, reciting the standard line without any attempt to explain or clarify. Linda hesitated, a flicker of disappointment crossing her face. She had hoped for a more attentive response, a willingness to listen and understand. Taking a deep breath, she carefully placed her bank statements on the counter, arranging them neatly as if presenting evidence in a case. "But I've had this account for years," she explained, her voice tinged with a hint of pleading, "and never had these charges before. I'd just like to understand." Brittany exhaled sharply, a dramatic sigh that was clearly intended to convey her impatience and annoyance. She grabbed the papers from Linda's hands, her movements abrupt and disrespectful, flipped through them lazily, her eyes scanning the documents without any real attempt to comprehend the details. Then, with a dismissive flick of her wrist, she shoved them back across the counter, as if discarding a worthless object. "It's in the fine print of your agreement," she said, her tone curt and unapologetic. "If you didn't read it, that's not our fault. We're not responsible for your lack of diligence." A few customers in line overheard the exchange and snickered, their amusement adding to Linda's growing discomfort and humiliation. The sound was like a slap in the face, a public confirmation of her vulnerability. Linda felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, staining her cheeks with a warm blush. She had always prided herself on being independent and capable, and this public display of her perceived ignorance stung deeply. Still, she held her ground, her resolve hardening despite the rising tide of humiliation. She straightened her shoulders, refusing to be intimidated by Brittany's dismissive attitude. "I understand policies change," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands, "but these fees weren't here before. Could you take a moment to review them, please? Perhaps there's been an error. It would really help me understand." Brittany rolled her eyes dramatically, making no attempt to hide her exasperation. She leaned forward, her voice now dripping with condescension and amplified so that others around them could hear, further amplifying Linda's humiliation. "Look, ma'am," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm, "if you want to avoid fees, you need to keep more money in your account. That's how banks work. It's not rocket science. It's basic financial responsibility." The public humiliation had begun, and Linda felt increasingly exposed under the judging eyes of the other customers. The weight of their silent scrutiny pressed down on her, making her feel small and insignificant. Each second at the counter felt like an hour as the tension in the air thickened around her. Linda swallowed the lump in her throat, fighting back tears of frustration and injustice. She wasn't trying to cause trouble, to make a scene, or to demand special treatment. She just wanted fairness, transparency, and a simple explanation. She had banked here for decades, entrusted this institution with her hard-earned savings, and yet at this moment she was being treated as if she were a burden, a nuisance, less than a valued customer, less than a human being deserving of respect. The feeling of betrayal was sharp and painful, cutting through her like a knife. As she glanced around, a wave of disappointment washed over Linda. She realized no one was coming to her defense, no one willing to speak out against the blatant disrespect she was experiencing. The same people who had been impatiently complaining about their long wait times moments ago now refused to make eye contact with her, their gazes averted as if she were invisible. They were willing to ignore her struggle, perhaps because, deep down, they knew it could easily happen to them too, that they too could one day find themselves at the mercy of uncaring institutions. The fear of being in her shoes, of being vulnerable and powerless, was a potent silencer, keeping them from offering even a word of support. A sense of profound isolation settled over her, a feeling of being utterly alone in the face of injustice. From across the lobby, Carl Jensen, the bank's branch manager, had been watching the interaction unfold with a critical eye, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disdain. A tall, heavy-set man in his 40s, Carl carried himself with the air of someone who believed his time was too valuable to waste on people who didn't belong in his bank. Those who didn't project the image of wealth and success that he valued. He saw the customers as a reflection of his own success, and Linda, with her modest appearance and quiet demeanor, simply didn't fit the profile of a valued client. He had initially hoped that Brittany would handle the situation quickly and quietly, but it was clear that the elderly woman was proving to be more persistent than he had anticipated. With a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes, a practiced expression of polite indifference, he approached the counter, his polished shoes clicking authoritatively against the marble floor, each step a deliberate announcement of his importance. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice smooth but edged with a hint of impatience, though his tone made it clear he wasn't really looking for an answer, but rather seeking to assert his authority and restore order to the situation. He approached the counter with a predatory gleam in his eyes, intent on quashing the situation swiftly. Brittany straightened up instantly, her earlier smugness replaced by a nervous eagerness to appease her superior and avoid any potential repercussions. Her posture transformed from relaxed indifference to alert attention in a single moment. "No problem, sir," she responded quickly, her voice laced with deference. "Just a customer who doesn't understand our policies, sir." She offered a sycophantic smile, hoping to deflect any blame for the escalating situation. The transformation in her demeanor was striking, from dismissive authority figure to submissive employee in the blink of an eye. Carl turned his gaze toward Linda, his eyes sweeping over her with a dismissive glance, looking her up and down as if she were an inconvenience rather than a loyal patron of the bank for over 3 decades. His eyes lingered for a moment on her worn handbag and her simple, unfashionable attire, making a silent assessment of her worth. The gold watch on his wrist caught the fluorescent light as he shifted his weight, a stark contrast to Linda's modest appearance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice condescending and dismissive, "we have standard fees in place, as Brittany has explained. If you can't maintain the minimum balance required to avoid those fees, then there's simply nothing we can do. These policies are clearly outlined in our account agreements." Linda squared her shoulders, refusing to shrink under his condescending scrutiny. She had taught generations of students to stand up for themselves, to fight for what was right, and she wasn't about to abandon those principles now, even in the face of such blatant disrespect. The teacher in her, the woman who had commanded classrooms and guided young minds for decades, emerged in her posture and tone. "I have always kept my account in good standing," she said, her voice unwavering despite the heat rising in her chest and the tremor in her hands. "I'm not asking for special treatment, Mr. Jensen. I'm only asking for clarification, for a simple explanation. I deserve to know why I'm being charged for something that wasn't part of my agreement when I opened this account, something that has suddenly appeared out of nowhere." Carl let out a short, amused chuckle, a sound that was both dismissive and condescending, designed to belittle her concerns and assert his dominance. The sound echoed slightly in the hushed bank, drawing attention from nearby customers who had been pretending not to listen. His next words, loud and deliberate, were meant to drive his point home in front of everyone, solidifying his authority and silencing any further dissent. He leaned slightly over the counter, invading Linda's personal space, his eyes glinting with cold indifference. "What's in the system is in the system, ma'am," he stated, his voice firm and unyielding. "We don't review automated charges. Those fees are automatically applied and there's nothing we can do to change that. And frankly," he added, his voice laced with a thinly veiled threat, "if you can't afford the fees, maybe this isn't the right bank for you. There are plenty of other options out there that might be more suitable for your financial situation." The implication was clear. Linda didn't belong in his bank, didn't meet his standards for a valued customer. The entire room fell silent. The hum of the fluorescent light suddenly amplified in the stillness, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick marking the passage of time and the escalating tension in the room. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, averting their eyes, their discomfort palpable in the charged atmosphere. Linda's breath caught in her throat, a sharp intake of air that betrayed her shock and hurt. The words stung, each one like a slap, leaving her feeling exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her, making her feel small, insignificant, and utterly invisible. The envelope in her hand suddenly felt heavier, a symbol of her diminished worth in their eyes, a reminder of her financial vulnerability. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision, but she refused to let them fall, determined to maintain her dignity in the face of such blatant disrespect. And then, before she could respond, before she could muster the strength to defend herself or articulate the injustice she was feeling, a deep, steady voice cut through the oppressive tension like a knife, shattering the carefully constructed facade of indifference and challenging the established power dynamic. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The shift in the room was instant and palpable, a seismic jolt that reverberated through the entire space. Heads turned toward the entrance, necks craning to see the source of the unexpected challenge, like sunflowers turning to face the sun. The collective gaze of the room shifted from Linda and Carl to the figure standing defiantly at the entrance, a beacon of hope in the sterile environment of the bank. A man stood there, casual in jeans and a black t-shirt, a baseball cap pulled low over his face, casting his features in shadow and adding an air of mystery to his presence. At first glance, he looked like any other customer, perhaps a construction worker or a delivery driver stopping in to cash a check, someone who wouldn't warrant a second glance. But there was something about him, his stance, his unwavering gaze, his quiet but commanding presence, his voice, that made people straighten up and take notice, that commanded attention and respect. An unspoken authority emanated from him, hinting at a strength and resolve that lay beneath his ordinary appearance, a promise of unwavering support. The atmosphere in the bank shifted immediately, charged with a new energy, a sense of anticipation. Carl turned slowly, irritation flashing across his face like a summer storm, his carefully constructed composure momentarily cracking under the weight of the unexpected interruption. The audacity of this stranger, this interloper, questioning his authority in his bank in front of his customers, was simply intolerable. He puffed out his chest, attempting to regain control of the situation and reassert his dominance. "And who are you to question how we handle our customers?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain, his eyes narrowed in a mixture of anger and curiosity. He expected the man to back down, to stammer an apology and retreat into the anonymity of the crowd, intimidated by his position and his authority. The man took a few steps forward, closing the distance between them with a deliberate, unhurried pace. Each step was measured and purposeful, radiating an aura of quiet confidence and unwavering resolve that further unsettled Carl. The sound of his boots against the polished floor echoed in the hushed space, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the accelerated heartbeats of everyone watching. He reached up and slowly, deliberately pulled off his cap, the simple act imbued with a sense of drama, as if a spotlight had suddenly illuminated the stage, revealing the identity of the unexpected protagonist. The cap came off with a soft whoosh, revealing a familiar, clean-shaven head and a pair of piercing, unforgettable eyes. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave, a collective intake of breath that was almost deafening in the otherwise silent room. A young teller nearly dropped the stack of bills she was counting, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. The murmurs and whispers intensified, escalating into a collective buzz of astonishment and disbelief. Heads swiveled, eyes widened to their fullest extent, and mouths dropped open in stunned silence. Even the most jaded customers, those who had seen it all, were caught off guard by the unfolding spectacle. Because standing in the middle of the bank, bathed in the sterile fluorescent light, staring Carl down with an unmistakable intensity that could melt steel and a quiet determination that brooked no argument, was none other than Vin Diesel. Yes, that Vin Diesel, the fast and furious star, the action legend, the man who embodied strength, justice, and unwavering loyalty on the silver screen. His presence was larger than life, a stark contrast to the mundane reality of the bank. In person, he seemed both exactly as he appeared on screen and somehow more real, more intense, more present. He was a symbol of standing up for what's right, of protecting the underdog, and his very presence seemed to electrify the atmosphere, transforming the ordinary bank into a stage for an extraordinary drama. Carl's cocky stance wavered, his carefully constructed facade of authority cracking under the weight of Vin Diesel's gaze. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and flustered, his carefully styled hair suddenly seeming disheveled and out of place. His fingers, which had been so confidently adjusting his tie moments before, now trembled slightly, betraying the sudden anxiety that had overtaken him. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry, his carefully rehearsed words failing him completely. Vin turned to Linda, his expression softening, his eyes conveying a genuine concern and respect that was a stark contrast to the dismissive glares she had received from the bank staff. The transformation in his expression was remarkable. The intensity that had made Carl physically recoil softened into genuine empathy. "Ma'am, you said these fees weren't here before, that you've been a loyal customer for over 3 decades?" His voice was softer now, but no less commanding, the famous deep timbre instantly recognizable to everyone in the room. Linda, still somewhat stunned that Vin Diesel himself had come to her defense, that this Hollywood icon was standing up for her against this institution, nodded, her eyes wide with disbelief and gratitude. The emotional whiplash from humiliation to suddenly being the focus of a Hollywood star's concerned attention left her momentarily speechless. Finding her voice, she straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from the respect she was finally being shown. "I've had this account for over 30 years, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air and the lingering sting of humiliation. "These fees just started showing up 2 months ago, without any warning or explanation." Vin shifted his attention back to Carl, his gaze hardening, his expression becoming steely. The warmth he had shown Linda vanished, replaced by the focused intensity of a man who would not be deterred. 2 months ago, his brow lifted slightly, his tone deceptively calm but laced with an underlying threat that sent a shiver down Carl's spine. "So tell me, Carl, why did the maintenance fees on her account suddenly triple? What justification can you possibly offer for such a drastic and unexplained increase?" The way he emphasized Carl's name, familiar, direct, slightly challenging, further undermined the manager's authority. It was a subtle power move, establishing that they were equals in this confrontation, despite Carl's title or position. The other customers watched in fascination, many of them mentally checking their own recent bank statements, wondering if they too had been quietly charged additional fees. Carl forced a tight-lipped smile, trying to regain control of the situation and project an air of confidence that he no longer felt. His years of management training kicked in. When challenged, appear calm and authoritative, never admit fault, defer to policy. "Mr. Diesel," he began, emphasizing the formality to re-establish professional distance, "I don't think you understand how banking works. Fees are adjusted based on policies set at the corporate level. These decisions are made far above my pay grade." He gestured vaguely towards the ceiling, a theatrical motion meant to imply a faceless bureaucracy that was beyond his control, absolving him of responsibility. "If she doesn't meet the requirements for a premium account, she incurs charges. That's how it's structured. It's all very clearly outlined in our terms and conditions." Vin nodded slowly, pretending to consider the explanation, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He ran a hand over his smooth scalp, a gesture familiar to fans of his films, often preceding a moment of revelation or decisive action. "Right," he said, drawing out the word. "So it's just a coincidence that these fees suddenly appeared on her account after 30 years of loyal service?" The question lingered, highlighting the absurdity of Carl's explanation. Then his expression hardened, the muscles in his jaw and neck tensing visibly. His voice dropped to a low, menacing growl that would have been at home in any of his action films, but carried an even more powerful impact in the reality of the bank lobby. "But tell me, Carl, do you actually review those charges? Do you take the time to check to make sure they're accurate and justified? Or do you just assume the system is always right, blindly trusting the computer without any human oversight?" Carl hesitated, clearly realizing he was walking into a trap, that any answer he gave would be used against him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his carefully rehearsed excuses seemed to evaporate in the face of Vin Diesel's unwavering gaze. The system is designed to be accurate, he said cautiously, choosing his words carefully. We have safeguards in place to prevent errors. Vin let out a short, knowing breath, almost amused, as if he had anticipated Carl's evasiveness. So you don't check, he stated flatly, cutting through Carl's carefully constructed facade. You simply rely on the computer to do its job without any human intervention or any concern for the impact on your customers. He glanced back down at the papers Linda had given him, flipping through them with sharp precision, his eyes scanning the documents with a keen intelligence. Here's what I see, Carl. A woman who's been banking here for decades, who has entrusted your institution with her hard-earned savings, suddenly gets hit with fees she was never informed about, fees that threaten her financial security. When she asks for clarification, she's mocked, humiliated, and dismissed by your staff. And now you're standing here telling me it's just policy? That it's just the way things are? Carl's face turned red, his carefully applied makeup failing to conceal the flush of anger and embarrassment. His fingers tapped nervously against his forearm, a nervous habit he had been trying to suppress for years. We follow guidelines, Carl muttered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights. We don't make exceptions. We have to treat everyone the same. Vin's expression darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. That's where you're wrong, Carl. That's where you completely misunderstand the meaning of fairness. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the entire bank, settling into every corner of the room, silencing the murmurs and whispers and commanding the attention of everyone present. Carl flinched slightly at the shift in tone, his carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. You do make exceptions, Vin continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, just not for people like Linda. You make exceptions for your wealthy clients, for your corporate accounts, for anyone who can bring more money into this bank, but you don't make exceptions for the elderly, for the vulnerable, for those who have been loyal to you for decades. A murmur rippled through the bank, a collective expression of agreement and outrage. Brittany, the young teller, cleared her throat, looking visibly uncomfortable and glancing nervously at Carl, as if seeking his permission to speak. Mr. Jensen, maybe we should just... Carl shot her a glare that made her mouth snap shut, silencing her before she could say anything that might further damage his position. But Vin wasn't finished. He turned toward the watching crowd, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the other customers, his voice resonating with sincerity and passion. How many of you have had unexpected fees show up on your accounts in the last few months? How many of you have been treated with disrespect and dismissal when you've questioned these charges? He folded his arms across his chest, his muscular frame radiating an unwavering sense of justice and determination, his gaze fixed intently on Carl. So, here's what you're going to do, Carl, he stated, his voice resonating with an undeniable authority. You're going to reverse every single one of those charges, not just for Linda, but for every single customer who has been affected by this blatant and unethical attempt to squeeze more money out of them. And then you're going to apologize, properly, publicly, and with genuine sincerity. Carl's jaw clenched so tightly that his muscles visibly strained. His career was flashing before his eyes, his carefully constructed world of power and prestige crumbling around him like a house of cards. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to manipulate people to get what he wanted. But now he was facing an opponent he couldn't intimidate, an adversary who held all the cards. Vin took another step closer, his imposing presence further diminishing Carl's already dwindling confidence. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the frantic pounding of Carl's heart. And if you don't? He let the question hang in the air for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in, before shaking his head slowly, a gesture of disappointment and thinly veiled threat. Well, let's just say I'd be really interested to see how corporate reacts when they find out their branch manager made headlines for defrauding elderly customers, for preying on the vulnerable and exploiting their trust. I'm sure they'd be absolutely thrilled to have that kind of publicity associated with their brand. Carl exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping in defeat, his carefully constructed facade of confidence finally crumbling. He knew he was beaten, that there was no way out of this situation. He had underestimated the power of public opinion, the unwavering resolve of Vin Diesel, and the simmering resentment of the customers he had taken advantage of for so long. He turned to Brittany, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes filled with desperation. "Fix it," he croaked, the words laced with a mixture of anger and resignation. Brittany wasted no time, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a newfound urgency, her earlier smugness replaced by a palpable sense of fear. She knew that her own job was on the line, that her future at the bank depended on her ability to rectify the situation quickly and efficiently. The rhythmic clicking of keys filled the silence, providing a soundtrack to Carl's downfall. And just like that, the power in the bank had shifted, the balance of authority tilting decisively in favor of the customers and against the institution that had wronged them. The atmosphere in the room had transformed, the air now thick with a sense of anticipation and a quiet satisfaction. What had been an environment of intimidation and dismissal became a space where accountability was possible, where injustice could be addressed. Carl Jensen's face was ashen, his once confident demeanor now reduced to pure defeat and humiliation. He had spent years controlling the bank's operations with a quiet arrogance, assuming that no one would ever dare to challenge him, that his position was unassailable. But now, in front of a room full of customers, employees, and the watchful eyes of Vin Diesel, his carefully constructed world was crumbling before his eyes, his authority reduced to nothing. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like an unbearable burden, crushing his spirit and leaving him feeling utterly defeated. Customers murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in disgust at his behavior, others watching with a quiet sense of satisfaction, reveling in his downfall. They had witnessed injustice unfold before them, had been subjected to the bank's unfair practices for months, but now for the first time, they were seeing someone hold the bank accountable, someone standing up for them against a powerful institution. Vin folded his arms tighter across his chest, his expression unchanging, his gaze unwavering. The muscles in his forearms tensed slightly, the only physical indication of his resolve. "Let's hear that apology, Carl," he stated, his voice firm and implacable. "Let's hear you acknowledge the wrong you've done and offer a sincere expression of remorse." Carl clenched his jaw, swallowing the bitter pill of humiliation that burned in his throat. He had never apologized to a customer before, let alone in such a public and humiliating situation. His reputation, his career, his entire sense of self-worth, everything was unraveling in real time, disintegrating before his very eyes. He forced out a stiff breath, struggling to maintain some semblance of composure, and turned toward Linda Carter, who stood strong despite the embarrassment and humiliation she had endured. Her quiet dignity in the face of his arrogance only heightened his sense of shame. Linda turned toward the young man near the front of the line, the same man who had been discreetly recording the entire interaction from the start, his phone held at a subtle angle, capturing every nuance of the unfolding drama. He smirked, a knowing glint in his eyes, holding up his phone as if presenting a piece of damning evidence. "Told you," he said with amusement, his voice just loud enough for Carl to hear, a mixture of triumph and vindication in his tone. "The video's already spreading like wildfire. It's gone viral, Mr. Jensen. The internet never forgets." Carl's stomach dropped as if the floor had suddenly fallen out from beneath him. His hand shook uncontrollably as he yanked his phone from his pocket, his fingers fumbling over the screen in a desperate attempt to assess the damage. He opened his notifications, and there it was. His name and face were already trending on every social media platform, his carefully crafted reputation being dissected and ridiculed by thousands of strangers. Captured in crystal-clear video thanks to the young man's steady hand and the bank's unforgiving fluorescent lighting, was every single word he had spoken, every condescending glance he had cast, every dismissive remark he had uttered with such arrogant certainty. His callousness, his lack of empathy, his blatant disregard for Linda's dignity, it was all there, laid bare for the world to see, amplified and magnified by the power of social media. And now the entire world was watching, judging, and condemning him for his actions. Carl's breath hitched in his throat, his lungs seizing up, his vision blurring with a mixture of panic and disbelief. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible, a desperate denial of the reality that was rapidly unfolding around him. The customers inside the bank weren't just passive witnesses anymore. They had become active participants in the drama, empowered by the technology in their hands and united by a shared sense of outrage. They had taken out their phones, checking social media feeds, reading the comment sections, seeing how fast the story was picking up traction, how quickly his carefully constructed world was collapsing. The quiet bank lobby had transformed into a hub of digital activism, with each notification sound marking another nail in Carl's professional coffin. One woman, a middle-aged customer standing near the back who had been subjected to similar treatment by the bank in the past, chuckled to herself, a hint of long-awaited satisfaction in her voice. "Well, that's what happens when you mess with the wrong people," she muttered, her eyes fixed on Carl with a mixture of amusement and disdain, a sense of karma finally being served. Her comment, though quiet, carried in the hushed atmosphere, drawing nods of agreement from those nearby. Another man, dressed in a crisp suit, who had also experienced the bank's unfair practices and had silently seethed with resentment, smirked, a knowing glint in his eyes. "You know corporate's about to have a field day with this," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm and schadenfreude. "Heads are going to roll, Mr. Jensen, you can bet on that." His comment elicited a few knowing chuckles from the crowd, everyone understanding the implications. In the corporate world, public relations disasters were often handled by finding a scapegoat. Carl's entire body went rigid, his muscles tensing, his mind racing to find a way out of this rapidly escalating nightmare. He could already imagine the fallout, the frantic calls from the corporate office demanding an immediate explanation, the relentless media attention scrutinizing every aspect of his life and career, the flood of complaints that would be filed against him, tarnishing his reputation and jeopardizing his future. His breathing became shallow, his tie suddenly feeling like a noose around his neck. Then, as if summoned by the sheer force of his anxiety, the phone on the counter rang, its shrill tone piercing the tense silence and sending a jolt of fear through Carl's already shattered nerves. The sound seemed louder than usual, cutting through the murmurs and whispers like a knife. Brittany, the young teller, glanced at the caller ID, her eyes widening in a mixture of fear and apprehension. "It's corporate," she announced, her voice barely above a whisper, her face pale with dread. "They want to speak to Mr. Jensen immediately." The words hung in the air, confirming everyone's expectations and adding a new layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Carl's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest heaving, his face ashen and drained of all color. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in, the consequences of his actions becoming unavoidably clear. His phone vibrated again in his hand, a text message from his regional manager. "My office, tomorrow, 8 a.m., bring your keys." The brevity spoke volumes. The young man with the phone, emboldened by the shift in power and sensing the collective feeling of triumph in the air, grinned at Linda, his eyes shining with admiration and respect. "Mrs. Carter, I think you just made history," he declared, his voice ringing with genuine enthusiasm and carrying throughout the now silent bank. "You stood up to a bully, exposed a corrupt system, and inspired everyone in this room and countless others online. You're a true hero, Mrs. Carter, and don't you ever forget it." He held up his phone, the small device now a symbol of the power of citizen journalism and the speed at which injustice could be exposed in the digital age. Brittany, who had played a significant part in Linda's mistreatment, her face a mask of shame and regret, hesitated for a long moment before stepping closer, her usual air of superiority completely gone, replaced by a genuine sense of contrition and a desperate desire for forgiveness. Her posture was less rigid now, her shoulders slumped with regret, her eyes downcast, avoiding Linda's gaze. She cleared her throat, her voice barely audible above the low hum of the bank, struggling to find the words to express the depth of her remorse. "Mrs. Carter," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes welling up with tears. I just want to say I'm so incredibly sorry for the way I spoke to you earlier. It was disrespectful, it was unkind, and it was completely unwarranted. There's no excuse for my behavior, and I take full responsibility for my action." Linda studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, searching for any sign of insincerity or self-serving motives in the young woman's face. She had learned a great deal about human nature over her long life, and she knew that an apology, to be truly meaningful, had to come from a place of genuine remorse and a commitment to change. Finally, seeing the genuine pain and regret etched on Brittany's face, she nodded slowly, a hint of forgiveness softening her gaze. "I appreciate that, Brittany," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion and understanding. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Brittany hesitated again, her lower lip trembling, struggling to contain the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. The fluorescent lights overhead caught the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "And I'm really sorry you had to come here and fight for something that should have been yours in the first place," she continued, her voice choked with emotion. "You deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, and I failed to do that. I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me." She hung her head, unable to meet Linda's gaze, her body trembling with shame. That was the apology that truly mattered, the one that acknowledged the systemic injustice, recognized Linda's inherent worth, and expressed genuine remorse for the pain and humiliation she had been forced to endure. It wasn't just a hollow recitation of words. It was a sincere expression of regret, a heartfelt plea for forgiveness, and a commitment to do better in the future. Everyone in the bank could hear the difference between this genuine contrition and the forced corporate apologies they were accustomed to receiving. Linda gave her a small, tired smile, a gesture of acceptance and forgiveness that conveyed a sense of grace and understanding. The lines around her eyes deepened slightly, reflecting a lifetime of both joy and hardship. "Thank you, Brittany," she said, her voice filled with warmth and compassion. "I accept your apology. And I hope that this experience will teach you a valuable lesson about the importance of treating everyone with kindness and respect, regardless of their age, their background, or their financial status." The customers inside the bank, once silent bystanders who had stood by and watched as Linda was humiliated, now looked on with a mixture of admiration and shame. Admiration for her dignity and grace, shame for their own inaction when they could have spoken up. Several shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own complicity in allowing injustice to flourish through their silence. For years, she had taught her students to stand up for what was right, to never let injustice go unchallenged, to use their voices even when it was difficult or frightening. She had instilled in them the courage to question authority when necessary, and the wisdom to recognize when something was fundamentally unfair. And now, in a twist of fate that seemed almost poetic, she had lived out that very lesson in the most unexpected and public way imaginable, becoming an unwitting symbol of resistance against corporate greed and Then, one ordinary morning, as the autumn sunlight filtered through her kitchen curtains, an envelope arrived in the mail, nestled among the usual bills and advertisements that filled her mailbox each day. The golden light illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air of her modest but immaculately kept home. At first she thought it was from the bank, perhaps another formal letter about the refunded fees, filled with carefully crafted corporate language designed to acknowledge wrongdoing without admitting liability. But when she picked it up, noticing the weight of the expensive paper and the unfamiliar return address, she saw the postmark: Los Angeles, California, a city thousands of miles away that seemed to exist in an entirely different world from her quiet suburban neighborhood. Her heart skipped a beat, a flutter of anticipation rising in her chest as she realized the implications. She set down her morning tea, the ceramic mug making a soft clink against the kitchen table. It wasn't from the bank at all, with their sterile, impersonal communications. It was from a film studio, the embossed logo gleaming subtly in the morning light, a tangible connection to the extraordinary events that had transformed her ordinary life. The gold foil caught the sunlight, sending tiny rainbows dancing across her kitchen wall. Curious, her fingers trembling slightly with anticipation, she carefully opened it, taking care not to tear the expensive envelope, and found a single handwritten note on thick, cream-colored stationery, the handwriting bold and distinctive. The paper felt substantial between her fingers, nothing like the thin computer-printed letters she usually received. "Mrs. Carter, you didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you of the power you've always possessed. Your courage that day inspired everyone who witnessed it, myself included. Hope this makes you smile. With respect and admiration, Vin." Linda blinked back tears as she ran her fingers over his signature, feeling the slight indentation where his pen had pressed into the paper, making the connection between them tangible and real, not just a surreal memory or a viral video that millions had watched. The physical evidence of his thoughtfulness touched her deeply. Tucked inside the envelope was a signed Fast and Furious poster, the glossy surface capturing Vin in one of his iconic poses, with a personal message scrawled across the bottom, "To Linda," the real hero of this story. And alongside it, something that made her gasp audibly in her empty kitchen. A personalized invitation to one of Vin Diesel's upcoming movie premieres, complete with first-class travel arrangements and accommodations at a luxury hotel. She laughed, a full, heartfelt laugh that bubbled up from deep within her and echoed through her small home, a laugh that shook away every last trace of the humiliation she had felt that day at the bank, replacing it with a profound sense of vindication and joy. The sound of her own laughter surprised her. It had been so long since she had felt this light, this free from the weight of daily struggles and small indignities. She set the note down gently on her kitchen table and leaned back in her chair, the morning sunlight warming her face as she absorbed the magnitude of what had happened. For the first time in a long time, perhaps since her retirement, she felt truly seen, not just as an elderly woman easily dismissed and overlooked, but as a person of substance and worth, someone whose dignity mattered. She had spent her life teaching others, caring for them, shaping young minds with wisdom and patience, pouring herself into generation after generation of students who had gone on to live their own lives, often forgetting the teacher who had played such a crucial role in their development. And now, for once, someone had reminded her that her worth wasn't just in what she had given to the world. Her worth was inherent in who she was, in her fundamental humanity that deserved respect, regardless of her age or financial status. She stood up, stretching her back, which had grown stiff from sitting, and walked to her front door, pulling it open to feel the fresh morning air. The morning sun was warm against her face, bathing her in golden light, and she took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in years, as if some invisible burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The neighborhood looked the same trees, the same houses, the same quiet street, but she felt transformed, renewed. The world wasn't perfect, and people like Carl Jensen would always exist, people who valued profit over people, who abused their power and treated others as less than. There would always be those who looked at someone like her and saw only an elderly woman, an easy target, someone who could be dismissed and disrespected without consequences. But now she knew with absolute certainty that when you fight for what's right, when you stand your ground and refuse to be silenced, sometimes the right people show up to fight with you. Sometimes justice prevails in the most unexpected ways, through the most unlikely champions. And that made all the difference in a world that often seemed indifferent to individual suffering and systemic injustice. This story isn't just about one woman's battle against an unfair bank policy. It's about the power of speaking up when facing injustice, the importance of standing against discrimination in all its forms, and the remarkable strength of those who refuse to be silenced even when the odds seem insurmountable. It's about the ripple effects of courage, how one person's stand can inspire countless others to examine their own lives and choices. Vin Diesel didn't have to step in that day, didn't have to risk potential backlash or negative publicity. He could have walked past, kept his head down, minded his own business like everyone else in that bank. But he chose to use his voice, his influence, and his presence to expose injustice, to stand beside someone who needed an ally. And because he did, because he refused to be a silent bystander, real, tangible change happened, affecting not just Linda, but countless other customers who had been similarly mistreated. But the lesson here isn't just about him, about celebrity intervention or viral videos. It's about all of us, about the choices we make every day, about the kind of world we create through our actions and our silences. How often do we witness unfairness and say nothing? How many times do we choose silence because it's easier, because speaking up might cost us something, because the injustice doesn't directly affect us? How frequently do we look away, pretending not to see, convincing ourselves that it's not our problem to solve? The next time you see injustice, whether it's in a bank, a workplace, a school, or on the street, speak up. Use your voice, whatever platform you have, whatever influence you possess. Stand beside those who are being mistreated, marginalized, or dismissed. Because silence only empowers the oppressor, only perpetuates the systems that allow injustice to flourish unchecked. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe in standing up for what's right, if you're committed to creating a world where dignity and respect are afforded to everyone, regardless of their age, race, gender, or economic status. Because the world needs more voices like Linda Carter's, and like yours,